Hello, St. Mark's. So we finally come to the end of this series on English hymns. And today we'll start with the turn of the 20th century. As I mentioned last week, I run into issues with copyright in the middle of this video, and so I really can't go any further and include musical examples on YouTube. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the reign of Queen Victoria ended on July 22nd, 1901. Her son Edward VII became king, and he was a very different monarch from his mother. He loved high fashion and high society. King Edward also had a spirit of freedom and adventure, as opposed to his mother, who was much more austere. The Edwardian era ushered in some great English composers, such as Herbert and Charles Villiers Stanford. In the Church of England, disputes and ecclesiastical court cases over Anglo-Catholic ideals and practices had come to an end. Anglo-Catholic clerics were beginning to rise into the church hierarchy, and a few of them had become bishops by this point. English vicar and contributor to the English Hymnal, Maurice F. Bell, wrote regarding church music of his time, "Sugar is an important article of food, but a diet entirely consisting of sugar would afford neither satisfaction nor pleasure to the consumer." We could learn a few things, huh? We are popularly suffering in England from a music diet of this kind. There is much music in our homes as well as in our concert rooms and churches, but a very large part of it is what Mr. Bernard Shaw calls confectionery. We have learnt from the great masters of music to appreciate beauty, but we are in danger of being content to wallow in mere beauty, in forgetfulness of the fact that the obviously pretty has only superficial charm. We need much more of the music that will strengthen and uplift. Bell continued writing and essentially dissed hymns ancient and modern. And he didn't like it so much because it included this sugary music. Remember, hymns ancient and modern was the prevailing hymnal of the time and was quite popular with millions of copies in circulation. In 1904, a new edition of Hymns Ancient and Modern was produced, but it was universally disliked. Breaking with tradition, the 1904 edition was bound in red rather than blue, and earned it the nickname, "That Dreadful Red Book." The national press came out against the book. Some of the headlines read, from the Daily Mail, "A lamentable book, bad taste, bad poetry, and bad theology." From the Evening Star, "Since the late Mr. Bowdler rewrote the plays of Shakespeare, we have no more pitiful exhibition." From the Evening News, "Foolish, banal, vulgar, objectionable, and in every way lamentable." And from the Guardian, "Love's Labours Lost." The editors or proprietors had made an attempt to return to original tunes or original texts, when possible to eliminate the sugary nature of the tunes or texts. For example, "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" was returned to Charles Wesley's original text, "Hark how all the welkin rings." Welkin meaning sky or heaven. Basically, the editors of the 1904 Dreadful Red Book failed to acknowledge or realize just how popular and beloved their own publication had been. When compared to earlier editions, the 1904 of Hymns Ancient and Modern was a failure. It did, however, introduce some music beloved by us today. One hymn, for example, is hymn number 296 that we sing quite often at baptism. which of course is one of only 2 hymns in the Hymnal 1982 that includes an Amen. In 1906, as an attempt to sort of bring the 1904 hymnal back into usage, a supplement was created. And this 1916 supplement included hymn 473, Lift High the Cross. In 1906, Piercy Dermer and Ralph Vaughan Williams issued the English Hymnal in reaction to the widespread dissatisfaction with the 1904 edition of Hymns Ancient and Modern. As Vaughan Williams recalls, "It must have been in 1904 that I was sitting in my study in Barton Street, Westminster, when a cab drove up to the door and Mr. Dermer was announced. I just knew his name vaguely as a person who invited tramps to sleep in his drawing room. But he had not come to talk to me about tramps. He went straight to the point and asked me to edit the music of a hymn book. I protested that I knew very little about hymns, but he explained to me that Cecil Sharp had suggested my name, and I found out afterwards that Canon Scott Holland had also suggested me as a possible editor. And the final clench was given when I understood that if I did not do the job, it would be offered to a well-known church musician with whose musical ideas I was much out of sympathy." One of the major factors in the success of the English hymnal was that they were creating something new rather than being curators of a much-loved tome. Another distinguishing characteristic of the English hymnal was the emphasis placed on using texts of major literary figures, including William Blake, George Herbert, Robert Herrick, Charles Kingsley, Sir Walter Scott, Edmund Spence, and Alfred Lord Tennyson. The English hymnal also included text by American authors, such as Phillips Brooks and Oliver Wendell Holmes. Hymn 79 and 78 are an example of a text by Phillips Brooks, who served as the founding rector of Trinity Church in Copley Square in Boston, and also as the Bishop of Massachusetts. Hymn 79 is likely the tune that most Americans know. And this tune has a lot of those Victorian sentiments that I talked about last week with these chromaticisms. But the English version is hymn 78. Which is from an English folk hymn, and to me is much more fun to sing. I'll talk a little bit more about the relationship to folk tunes and the English hymnal soon. Another example of an American text included in the English hymnal is hymn 419, Lord of All Being Throned Afar, which is a text by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Other notable examples of hymns by great literary figures that I cannot play due to copyright issues include hymn number 382, King of Glory, King of Peace, with a text by George Herbert. Also, hymn 487, Come, My Way, My Truth, My Life, with a text by George Herbert, set with a tune by Ralph Vaughan Williams. Also, hymn number 565, He Who Would Valiant Be, by Percy Dermer, the editor of the hymnal, compared with a tune by Ralph Vaughan Williams, the music editor of the English Hymnal. One beloved hymn tune that first appeared in the first edition of the English Hymnal is the tune associated with hymn number 618, Ye Watchers and Ye Holy Ones, and the text is by John Athelstan Laurie Riley. The proprietors of hymns ancient and modern did not take this lying down. In fact, they were a bit put out by their new competition and refused to give permission to reprint their copyrighted material. So, what made the English hymnal so different from its predecessors? I mean, after all, the English hymnal attempted to produce a musically and textually sound collection of hymns, being faithful to the author's original intent as much as possible, similar to the editorial goals of hymns ancient and modern. But essentially, the difference boils down to the fact that Dermer and Vaughan Williams were both extremely talented in their fields. Dermer found, edited, and reworked quality texts that were accessible. Vaughan Williams had profound talent for selecting singable melodies intended to be sung in unison by a congregation, in contrast to the Victorian hymn tunes, which were often monotonous in favor of having interesting harmonies, requiring them to be sung in 4 parts in order to be interesting. Dermer and Vaughan Williams also had a great sense of balance between ancient plainsong melodies, hymns from the Reformation from both England and the continent, as well as folk melodies from various language and cultural traditions, especially from German, French, Swiss, Italian, Spanish, Flemish, Dutch, and American sources. They also made an effort to include tunes from all over the British Isles, including Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. Basically, they were not purists as other editors had been. They weighed the textual and musical merits of each hymn and selected only those that stood up to their good taste. They also had the sense to recognize that some potential customers may not buy the hymnal if certain lowbrow hymns were not included. Dermer and Vaughan Williams put those hymns in a special section called For Mission Service, with a subtitle, not for ordinary use. In secret, behind closed doors and only between themselves, the editors referred to this section as the Chamber of Horrors. The extensive incorporation of folk tunes from various sources was revolutionary. Folk tunes had been shunned by previous generations. As Gustav Holst, composer and friend of Vaughan Williams, once said, "Folk songs are either bad or Irish." The use of folk tunes as hymn tunes also had the effect of shifting from the four-part Victorian tradition to a strong congregational unison tradition. In the preface to the English Hymnal, Vaughan Williams writes, "Every hymn is so arranged that it can be sung in unison accompanied by the organ. The congregation must always sing the melody, and the melody only." There are two excellent examples of hymns written by Ralph Vaughan Williams that were intended to be sung in unison. But because Vaughan Williams died in 1958, I can't play them in the public domain until 2033. So you'll have to look back at old live stream broadcasts. The first is hymn number 287, For All the Saints. Check out November 1st. Also, hymn number 175, Hail Thee Festival Day. Check out the live streams for Easter or Pentecost of 2020. The English hymnal was also a new standard for hymnals, in that its goals were similar to other collections such as Hymns Ancient and Modern, by being a companion to prayer book worship. However, the English hymnal was more specifically liturgical. It offered hymns that not merely meant to be used within the liturgy, but hymns that were linked with specific liturgical functions. For example, the introit, or the entrance, the sequence, the offertory. A hymn was included after the prayer of humble access before communion, at communion, and after the blessing. A second edition of the English hymnal was published in 1933, with a supplement called English Praise in 1975. As most of you listening to this video know, the current authorized hymnal of the Episcopal Church is the hymnal 1982. This was commissioned by General Convention in 1982, but it wasn't actually put out for use until 1985. Around the same time, editors in England were working to produce a new version of the English hymnal. And in 1986, this book, the New English Hymnal, was produced. As many of you know, I took my first trip to England last year in November. It's been almost a year, and it's hard to believe. And while I was in England, I went to church at least once a day. I went to Evensong at King's College in Cambridge and St. John's College at Cambridge. I went to Evensong at Westminster Abbey. I went to a solemn high mass at St. Mary's Church, Bourne Street. And I went to the Advent Carol service at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In almost all of these churches, this was the hymnal they used. Only, instead of being the full music version like this one that has the music over here and the text over here, they had only the text printed in their hymnals. And this American organist was a bit put out that I couldn't sing the hymns because the music was not provided to me. In 2006, a supplement was put out for this hymnal, and there were plans to issue a new edition of this hymnal this year in 2020, but I'm unsure what the pandemic has done to that publication. And as you can tell from the way I've been talking through this video, this is the end of our English hymns discussion, mainly because I've hit the point that things are no longer in the public domain, and I would need special licensing to put this music on YouTube. So next week we'll start something different, and we may take a break from large themes and just do some one-off videos for a while. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of English hymns, and I hope to see all of you soon.
Uh-oh, you're evaluating my work.
I am.
Are you subscribed?
I will with the red button.
And give us a thumbs up.
I'm a fan, of course.